The school bell announced the end of another school day. Pedro lazily gathered his supplies and stuffed them into his backpack while his best friend Martin gave him a few last playful shoves on the shoulder. Summer vacation is coming up. Do you have any plans? Martin asked with a wide grin. Pedro shrugged. The usual, I guess. My parents will probably want to go to the beach or to my grandparents' country house. That sounds great. I wish my parents had a house like that to go to for vacation, Martin commented with a hint of envy in his voice. The two friends walked together for a couple of blocks, laughing and joking as was usual for them, until they separated to go to their respective homes. Pedro lived in a quiet residential neighborhood on the outskirts, where all the houses were quite similar. His home was a two-story dwelling with a small front garden and a larger backyard. His parents, Teresa and Ernesto, greatly valued that small patch of grass and the flower beds that surrounded it. It was the space where Pedro and his older sister Lucia had played during their childhood. Lucia, now 20 years old, was currently finishing her university studies in graphic design. She still lived with her parents to save on expenses but spent long periods in an apartment near the campus. At the moment, she was back home for spring break. Hey, little P. Lucia's voice called out to Pedro as soon as he crossed the doorway. She was sitting on the living room sofa with her legs tucked under her and her laptop on her lap. Lucia loved calling her brother by that affectionate nickname, although she knew Pedro wasn't too fond of it. How many times do I have to tell you not to call me that? Pedro protested, rolling his eyes. He flopped down next to her on the sofa and looked at the screen curiously. I'm looking for ideas for a university project, Lucia explained. We have to create a catalog for a fashion brand, and I'm looking at references. As if you needed help with that, Pedro joked. You're the most stylish person I know. Lucia affectionately ruffled her brother's hair while letting out a laugh. You're a walking disaster, little P. But you can relax, I'm not going to ask you to model for me tonight. Lucia's laughter faded when their parents entered the room. Teresa was carrying a tray with several plates of savory snacks. I thought we could all have a snack together, taking advantage of you being home, sweetie, she said with a smile to Lucia. Pedro licked his lips at the sight of the cream pastries and steaming croquettes he loved so much. His mother's home cooking was by far his favorite food. This looks delicious, Mom, he praised, taking a bite of a croquette. Well, Lucia, how are your studies going? Ernesto asked in a fatherly tone as he settled into his favorite armchair. The four of them ate and chatted for the next hour. Pedro told some anecdotes about his classmates and his biology teacher, making them all laugh. Ernesto talked about some pending projects at the engineering office where he worked, and Lucia updated them on her plans for the summer vacation, a trip of several months to various European cities with a group of friends. When they finished snacking, Lucia collected the plates while Pedro went out to the backyard. He intended to read for a while lying on the hammock that hung between 2 points among the trees. The days passed with their summer slowness. Pedro took advantage of the holidays to sleep late, play video games, watch series, and spend long periods in the backyard hammock with a book in hand. Occasionally, Martin would come over, and they would go out for a bike ride or entertain themselves by tossing a baseball back and forth. However, Pedro couldn't help but frequently glance towards the neighboring house. A strange feeling had settled in his mind, and he couldn't shake it off. It had all started a couple of weeks ago, shortly after the summer holidays began. Pedro was lying in the hammock, immersed in reading a mystery novel his father had recommended. Suddenly, some muffled noises coming from the adjacent property caught his attention. As he looked up, he could see his mysterious neighbor in the backyard, a tall, burly middle-aged man who always wore dark, stained clothes. Pedro had never managed to see his face clearly, as he usually avoided eye contact and kept his distance from the other neighbors. On this occasion, what he was doing was most strange. With a large shovel, he was digging a considerable hole in one of the corners of the garden. His expression was one of absolute, almost obsessive concentration, without stopping to rest for even a moment. Driven by curiosity, Pedro sat up and observed carefully as his neighbor continued his task for a good while. On a couple of occasions, he even seemed to glance around furtively, as if fearing someone might be watching him. Then, without warning, the man crouched down and dragged what looked like a large black garbage bag to the hole. No matter how much Pedro frowned and tried to sharpen his vision, it was impossible for him to distinguish its contents clearly. Whatever it was too heavy for a single person to move easily. The neighbor had to grimace with effort to manage to push the bag to the bottom of the excavation. Once there, he quickly began to cover it with the earth he had set aside earlier, using the shovel to pile it up. In no time, the hole was completely disguised, and the neighbor retreated with hurried steps towards the interior of his house, without looking back even once. Pedro was left breathless, his mouth slightly open in astonishment. What the hell had he just witnessed? Had that man just buried a corpse in his yard? No, that was crazy. There had to be a reasonable explanation. And yet, something in the furtive way his neighbor had acted kept unsettling him. That same night, during dinner, Pedro couldn't contain himself and shared his suspicions with the rest of the family. For a moment, they all fell silent and looked at each other with incredulous gestures. "Are you sure of what you saw, son?" Ernesto questioned with a furrowed brow. Pedro nodded vehemently. "Completely." "Mr. Robinson?" Teresa interrupted him. "You mean the kind neighbor next door?" "Yes, that one," Pedro exclaimed. "First, he dug a huge hole in his garden, then he dragged an enormous bag there and buried it hurriedly. I didn't dare to look at what was inside, but his behavior was most suspicious." A tense silence fell over the dining room. Lucia looked at her brother with arched eyebrows, as if she couldn't quite believe what he was saying. Ernesto and Teresa, for their part, seemed to be reflecting on what to say. "Well, Pedro," his mother finally intervened, "I think you've let yourself get carried away too much by your fondness for mystery novels. Mr. Robinson is an older man who lives alone and hardly ever leaves the house. You're not really going to think he's committed a murder, are you?" Pedro shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know, Mom, but what I saw would have a reasonable explanation, no doubt," Ernesto cut him off in a conciliatory tone. "Maybe he was doing gardening work and buried some organic remains for compost, or he had to get rid of some large object that no longer served him. These things happen." "Exactly, your father is right," Teresa agreed with a reassuring hand gesture. "Remember that Mr. Robinson is an elderly person who lives alone. The elderly often become a bit eccentric and do certain strange things that young people don't quite understand." Pedro frowned, not very convinced. He knew well what he had seen, and his instinct told him it wasn't something as innocent as simple gardening work. However, he was aware that the whole experience sounded too far-fetched, even by the standards of a detective novel. "All right, if you say so," he finally muttered reluctantly. "You shouldn't worry so much, sweetie," Lucia intervened with a kind smile. "This neighborhood is very quiet, and Mr. Robinson has been living here for years without ever causing problems." "Exactly," Ernesto backed her up. "So don't dwell on it anymore, okay? You were just a little bored, and your mind started imagining things." Pedro decided not to insist for the moment, but deep down, he knew he wouldn't be able to shake off that uneasiness so easily. In the following days, he set out to observe every movement of his mysterious neighbor with renewed attention, and it wasn't long before he discovered other equally intriguing behaviors. On a couple of occasions, he saw him arrive home with large bags of tools and construction materials, all wrapped in black plastics that were difficult to identify. Mr. Robinson acted stealthily, repeatedly looking around before dragging the packages into his house. On another occasion, Pedro went out to walk his dog Loki around the neighborhood, and upon crossing paths with Mr. Robinson on the street, the latter looked at him sideways with manifest unease and quickened his pace to avoid crossing paths with them. "There's something weird about that man, Loki," Pedro whispered to his dog. We'll discover what it is. A couple of weeks later, another incident occurred that came to fuel Pedro's suspicions. That day, he had gone to the nearby supermarket with his parents to do the weekly shopping. Ernesto and Teresa were in separate aisles, rummaging through the shelves, while Pedro had been tasked with managing the cart with the shopping list. The atmosphere in the Rodriguez household had become somewhat tense during the last few days. Summer vacation was about to end, and the whole family was preparing to resume their usual activities. Teresa and Ernesto would return to work, Lucia would go back to university, and Pedro would start a new school year. However, one topic of conversation dominated all family meals: Lucia's imminent trip. The young artist had planned, along with a group of friends, a long tour of various European cities over the coming months. Her idea was to visit different places, attend cultural events and art fairs, all to gain inspiration for her university projects. It will be a unique experience, Lucia exclaimed with bright eyes. We'll travel without a set plan, moving freely from one city to another. We want to visit iconic places but also out-of-the-way corners to absorb the authentic atmosphere. It seems like a great idea, honey, Teresa nodded with a smile, although her eyes, tinged with worry, betrayed her. But I have to admit that the idea of you being away from home for so many months makes me a bit nervous. Come on, woman, Ernesto calmed her, patting her on the shoulder. Lucia is already a fully grown and responsible woman. She'll manage well. Besides, she won't be alone at any time. Pedro listened silently to his older sister's plans, divided between the excitement of imagining all the adventures she would experience and the concern for his own situation at home. Because in addition to Lucia's trip, his parents had organized, as they did every summer, a small family vacation. On this occasion, they planned to spend a couple of weeks in the country house that his grandparents had on the outskirts of the city. It will be a good time to disconnect and rest before returning to work, Ernesto explained as he savored the stew that Teresa had prepared for dinner. Yes, and Pedro could also enjoy the last days of leisure before returning to school, his mother added, winking at him conspiratorially. Pedro was excited about the idea of spending a few days on his grandparents' farm, walking through the fields, harvesting fruits from the orchard, playing with the animals they had there. However, a small setback began to form in his mind. If he left with his parents, he would leave the house empty and unsupervised during those days. The mystery of the neighbor, Mr. Robinson, was still fluttering in his thoughts. No matter how hard he tried, Pedro couldn't shake off the unsettling feeling that that man was hiding a dark secret, and the mere idea of being absent and thus losing sight of him was extremely frustrating. Hey, Dad, he suddenly intervened during one of the dinners, couldn't I stay here at home while we go to the farm? I'm old enough to manage on my own for a few days. Ernesto's fork stopped midway, and both he and Teresa stared at their son for a few moments. Stay here alone. But why would you want to do that? His father finally inquired with a furrowed brow. Well, it's just that. Pedro hesitated, not knowing exactly what excuse to give. I feel like having a few days of tranquility for myself, playing with the console without anyone bothering me, and things like that. Ernesto and Teresa exchanged a look of perplexity, not quite believing this argument. But you've always enjoyed those family trips, Pedro, Teresa observed with a tone of reproach. Where does this sudden change come from? It's just that I'm older now and can fend for myself, he hastened to respond, aware that it didn't sound very convincing. His parents didn't seem willing to give in easily. After a few tense minutes of deliberation, Ernesto finally spoke up with a stern expression. I understand that at your age, you might want to enjoy more independence, son, but the truth is, I don't feel entirely comfortable with the idea of leaving you here alone for so long. But it's only going to be 2 weeks. Pedro protested with a pleading voice. Even so, you're too young to stay unsupervised for so long, Teresa intervened with a severe tone. You could get into trouble, or some problem could. Come on, woman, it's not that serious, Ernesto stopped her, raising a conciliatory hand. Pedro is 15 years old and he's a responsible boy. maybe we could. A long discussion ensued, during which Ernesto, influenced by his wife's reluctance, tried to argue various points of view. After much insistence, Pedro managed to get them to finally agree to his proposal, on the condition that his Aunt Monica, who lived a couple of blocks away, would commit to stopping by every 2 days to check that everything was alright. And so, 2 weeks later, the big day arrived. His parents and Lucia left early for the country house, leaving Pedro making promises to behave well and not cause any trouble. When the family car disappeared from view as it turned the corner, Pedro took a deep breath and sketched a mysterious smile. For the first time in a long time, he had free rein to investigate Mr. Robinson's strange movements without having to hide or fear being discovered. Determined to make the most of his opportunity, he hurried to prepare everything necessary for his imminent investigation: a small backpack with some provisions, a camera to take photographs, a notebook, and a pen in case he needed to take notes. With all his detective tools ready, all he had left to do was wait for his prey to make the next move. The hours passed slowly and tediously, with the boy stationed in the backyard from early morning. Mr. Robinson's house remained in an unsettling silence, without the slightest hint of activity. On a couple of occasions, Pedro entertained himself by making a few throws with his old baseball, scrutinizing the window of the adjacent room every so often. However, the thick curtains prevented him from seeing anything of what was happening inside. He was beginning to get impatient when, on the stroke of noon, a small movement at the front door of the house caught his attention. Mr. Robinson had finally come out, dressed in a dark jacket and a cap that shadowed his face. The man hurried to open the rear door of his dilapidated car and take out some loaded bags, maneuvering with difficulty due to their apparent excessive weight. He dragged them one by one into the house. The days passed slowly and boringly since his parents and Lucia had left for vacation. Pedro tried to keep himself occupied with video games, series, books, and any other activity he could think of, but the truth was that his main motivation was very different. He dedicated all his free time to watching every movement of the mysterious Mr. Robinson. From early morning, Pedro would station himself in the backyard with his binoculars, a camera, and a notebook. Any behavior out of the ordinary by his enigmatic neighbor was meticulously recorded. To better disguise his scrutiny, Pedro had even set up a small camping tent among the garden bushes. Inside, he felt like a real undercover detective, on the lookout for any clue that could unravel Mr. Robinson's dark secrets. His Aunt Monica showed up every 2 days, as agreed with his parents. The good woman was skeptical of her nephew's suspicions, but still made a quick inspection of the house before leaving with a shrug. During one of these routine visits, Monica couldn't help but comment jokingly, "If I didn't know you, Pedro, I'd say you have a little case of obsession brewing with this matter." Pedro frowned as he opened the front door for her, with the binoculars still hanging around his neck. "It's not an obsession, Aunt. It's just that this Robinson is plotting something dark, and I'm going to find out what it is." Monica slowly shook her head, letting out an incredulous chuckle. "Oh, Pedro, at your age I also had a lot of imagination, as your parents say. But that poor man has been living alone since his wife passed away years ago. Have a little charity and don't bother the elderly neighbors." "But I'm not bothering him," he protested energetically. "It's him who's behaving in a most strange way. He brings huge bags into his house, he sneaks out furtively in the early hours of the morning. Everyone has their routines and quirks, nephew," Monica cut him off with a patient tone. "Just because an old man isn't seen much on the street doesn't mean he's doing anything shady. These are just your imaginings." Pedro had to bite his tongue to avoid contradicting her. He knew that no matter how much he tried to explain, his aunt would never fully understand him. Once Monica had left, he returned to his surveillance post in the garden. Dark circles were beginning to form under his eyes from the sleepless nights. But that only fueled his determination, and finally, his obstinacy ended up being rewarded with a new chilling discovery. It happened during the early morning of a hot day in mid-August. Past 3 a.m., Pedro was lying on his bed, unable to fall asleep due to the intense summer heat. He had left the window of his room wide open, hoping that some small night breeze could refresh the atmosphere. Suddenly, a faint noise caught his attention, an urgent rumor like hurried footsteps moving stealthily down the street. Intrigued, Pedro cautiously peered through the window. Under the dim light of the street lamps, he distinguished a dark silhouette in motion, a hooded figure that advanced almost furtively, carrying a voluminous bundle in its arms. Pedro stifled a gasp of surprise when he recognized it. It was Mr. Robinson. Containing his breath, Pedro watched as the man slipped into the back alley that separated the houses on that street from the next. He moved with quick but very cautious steps, constantly scrutinizing his surroundings as if he feared being discovered at any moment. Guided by a sudden impulse, Pedro put on some sneakers and silently left his room. With all the stealth he could muster, he tiptoed through the house, went down to the foyer, and peeked through the peephole of the front door. Mr. Robinson had already left the alley and was heading towards his house, always with that strange bundle in his arms. Swallowing hard, Pedro opened the door just enough to slip outside without making a noise. Holding his breath, he ran as fast as he could to reach the alley and find out once and for all what was hiding behind that man's sinister nocturnal movements. The narrow back alley was almost in complete darkness, but Pedro had no difficulty distinguishing on the ground what appeared to be small loose traces of something dry and granulated. When he crouched down to pick up a handful, he found to his horror that it was earth and fine gravel, as if it had been scattered there recently. His suspicions ignited like a spark in flames. Clenching his fists with determination, Pedro hurried towards the place where the trail seemed to come from, the bottom of that narrow alley, near the metal gate that led to Mr. Robinson's backyard. What he discovered there left him petrified. In the corner, there was a huge trench dug in the earth, little more than a meter deep. The excavation had irregular walls and the bottom was full of soft, tangled sheets and blankets. Pedro put a hand to his mouth, stifling a choked cry of horror. That had all the traces of being a frightful grave. In a burst of courage, or perhaps recklessness, the young man crouched next to the hole and began to scrutinize it with the flashlight of his mobile phone. The nauseating stench emanating from that decomposing place turned his stomach. Among the folds of the dark sheets, hairs peeked out, tangled in detached tufts that gently swayed with the breeze of the warm night. He was about to faint from pure horror when a sudden rumor of nearby footsteps startled him. Stumbling, Pedro hurriedly left the alley and rushed to hide behind some garbage cans in a gap between buildings. Just in time, for a moment later, Mr. Robinson appeared through the same path Pedro had just left. With a dark raincoat covering him completely from neck to feet, the man walked in long strides without any disguise this time. His gloved hands dragged an immense and heavy black cloth sack that dragged on the ground, leaving a faint trail of gravel and dust in its wake. A cold shiver ran down Pedro's spine as he watched, paralyzed, Mr. Robinson's sinister proceeding. Hidden behind the garbage cans, he held his breath to make not the slightest noise that could give him away. His mysterious neighbor headed without hesitation towards the hole dug at the bottom of the alley. Upon reaching the edge, he suddenly dropped the heavy load he was transporting with a muffled and dull thud. The bundle collapsed against the disturbed earth in an unnatural position, as if it were alive and writhing. Cold sweat bathed Pedro's forehead, who had to make a tremendous effort to contain the nausea caused by the stench emanating from that strange wrapping. He blinked repeatedly, rubbing his eyes with his gloved hands to clear his vision. No matter how hard he tried, it was impossible for him to clearly distinguish the newly buried object. Mr. Robinson, meanwhile, seemed to have been satisfied. Without wasting a moment, he began to remove and pile up the surrounding earth to gradually cover the pit he had just finished. The speed and fury with which he handled the shovel contrasted with his previous meticulous stealth, as if the urgency to hide his latest actions had dissipated all trace of caution. In a matter of minutes, the hole was completely disguised and leveled with the surrounding terrain. Pedro watched in terror as faint tremors shook under the new layer of earth, as if something immense and shapeless was stirring in frantic convulsions. Little by little, the movement quieted down until it stopped completely. Mr. Robinson then stood up, wiping the sweat from his forehead with his forearm. For a few tense seconds, he remained motionless, contemplating his grim work. Then, with shoulders hunched under a sudden heaviness, he began his retreat back to his house, carrying the shovel and empty sacks. Pedro waited long minutes in his hiding place, paralyzed by fright and fearing to make any movement that would give him away. Part of him was dying to run out of that filthy alley, alert the entire neighborhood, and call the police immediately. But on the other hand, his amateur investigator's curiosity consumed him from within. He had to find out at all costs what kind of sadistic secret that man was hiding. Suddenly, one of the mounds seemed to move slightly, as if something inside was stirring desperately. Pedro stumbled backward, crawling on the ground with a mixture of panic and horror pounding in his chest. Was it possible that that endless black bundle concealed? Unable to finish that thought, he jumped to his feet and ran as if the devil himself were chasing him, abandoning that repugnant alley and its secrets. Once safe inside his house, he collapsed on the bed, trembling with fear and revulsion. He closed his eyes tightly in a vain attempt to erase from his mind the chilling images he had witnessed that night. It took hours for him to manage to fall into an uneasy sleep plagued by terrible nightmares where putrefied arms crawled out of the bowels of the earth to catch him. He tossed and turned restlessly among the sheets, screaming and fighting against the monstrous specters that relentlessly harassed him. He didn't know how long he was immersed in that horrifying drowsiness, only that he woke up soaked in cold sweat with the first lights of dawn seeping through the half-open window and an absolute determination burning in his pupils like incandescent embers. That day, his steps did not lead him to wander among video games or any reading as was his custom. He didn't even go out to the patio or take much food. He remained locked in his room, ruminating again and again on how much he had witnessed, devising a desperate plan of action. For if his suspicions were correct and Mr. Robinson was hiding a horrible criminal secret, he had to act quickly before it was too late. He couldn't stand idly by in the face of such madness, but he was unable to contact the authorities without evidence. Most likely, no one would believe him. The phone suddenly vibrated on the desk, startling him out of his reverie. Night had fallen over the neighborhood when Pedro finally decided to act. Staying locked up without doing anything was torture. He needed answers, to understand once and for all the horrible truth that was hiding behind Mr. Robinson's sinister acts. He dressed from head to toe in dark, comfortable clothes, put on sports shoes without making any noise, and went out to the backyard like an automaton. Cold sweat dripped from his forehead as he remembered the promise he had made to his parents about behaving well and not getting into trouble during their absence. Well, that was now beyond doubt. Taking a deep breath, he headed towards the neighboring house with stealthy steps. His right hand wielded a small but compact flashlight, while with his left he held a weak knife that his father kept in the toolbox in the basement. He didn't intend to use it for anything illegal, he repeated to himself over and over again. He was only carrying it just in case things got really ugly and he had to make his way at all costs. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to push those thoughts from his mind. In just a few more meters, he would reach the back door that led to Mr. Robinson's patio. The huge garden that opened before Pedro was completely deserted and in shadows. For a few moments, he hesitated about which way to go. However, a sudden movement caught his attention, a faint flickering light coming from the upper floor of the house. Perhaps it was there where the key to all that mystery was hidden. Guided by a renewed impulse, Pedro crossed the small garden area with long but very stealthy strides. In the blink of an eye, he found himself at the foot of the rear wall of the house. He pointed the flashlight upwards, discovering to his relief a small metal service ladder attached to the side that ascended to a tiny balcony. He held his breath as he climbed the worn steps. His heart accelerated with each meter that increased his height, as if he feared it would collapse at any moment. Nevertheless, he managed to reach the narrow balustrade that surrounded the balcony and cautiously peered in to inspect the interior. Thin curtains waved gently behind the only window that gave onto the projection, partially drawn back for him to peek through. Pedro pressed himself against the outer bars and poked an eye through the crack, holding his breath in tense silence. What he saw inside the room froze his blood until it was colder than ice. The small room was in perfect, almost clinical order, except in the center where an old work table appeared occupied by a kind of enormous shapeless mass seated on a solid high-backed chair. Around it, all kinds of sharp instruments were scattered in an apparently chaotic manner: blades, saws, pliers, files, and a multitude of bottles with viscous liquids of various dull and turbid shades. Bringing his eye even closer to the narrow crack, Pedro was finally able to distinguish the diffuse contours of that amorphous and compact mass seated in front of the table. Its shape was strange, grotesque, as if it were a person wrapped in tight cloth bandages. Around it, dozens of thin strands of shiny fiberglass serpentined, linking the figure with various points on the surface like a kind of fine and intricate cobwebs. With a violent start, Pedro then managed to glimpse the face of that immobile thing under the light of a desk lamp. Because it had a face, yes, but not one of flesh and blood like the others. It was a carved face, completely carved in a kind of hard white resin. Its features appeared almost human, defined and delicate, but in an artificial and unreal way, like a sculpture that was too perfect. Unable to suppress a spasm of terror, he averted his gaze from that aberration. A thick layer of cold sweat covered his forehead, and his hands trembled uncontrollably. Exhausted of strength, Pedro began his retreat stumbling, hurrying down the small ladder with such impetus that several steps came to creak under his footsteps. He had barely set foot on the ground when light suddenly came on inside the house. Through the living room windows, Pedro could distinguish some disturbing silhouettes moving in the room, two perfect and artificial figures, erect, slender, and elegant, but whose movements completely lacked naturalness. Terrified, Pedro backed away, unable to take his eyes off those horrible spectral forms that seemed to have acquired a life of their own. His back suddenly hit the wooden fence of the garden, making him lose his balance. As he tried to get up, his foot bumped against a small metal structure of macabre appearance that he hadn't noticed before. Lowering the flashlight to inspect it better, the boy found himself face to face with a sinister vision. It was a rudimentary cooking grill, but the grating was blackened as if by high temperatures, and between the bars, tiny charred remains could be glimpsed, as if they had burned human flesh there. The scream that Pedro choked in his throat seemed to alert the ghosts inside the house, for immediately their movement stopped abruptly. A myriad of black eyes, empty as bottomless wells, seemed to be fixed on him through the glass. Paralyzed by horror for an eternal instant, Pedro couldn't react in any way. Only when heavy footsteps approached from inside and hands began to draw back the curtains of the window did he finally manage to come out of his stupor. He turned around and started running as if chased by the very devil himself, crossing the backyard at full speed and the sparse separation of the gardens. He crossed the back alley in the blink of an eye, slipped as he turned the corner, and crashed face first into a garbage cart. The bruises and contusions would burn later, but at that moment his only thought was to get to safety. He crawled to get back up and rushed into his house, slamming the door shut and running to close and bar all entrances. Then he collapsed in the hallway, struggling to catch his breath and convinced that his heart would burst at any moment. The following days passed for Pedro in a haze of horrific unreality. After that fateful night and the terrible visions he had witnessed in Mr. Robinson's house, he was barely aware of what he was doing or what was happening around him. He spent hours locked up, barricaded in his room, and without taking his eyes off the window. On his lap rested a small but sharp knife that he didn't let go of under any circumstances, as if he feared that some indescribable horror might burst in at any moment and he would have to defend himself. He violently startled several times upon perceiving any movement in the neighboring house. His pulse quickened and his breathing became agitated in the midst of a sudden bout of panic, waiting to see some of those grotesque things he had glimpsed among the shadowy rooms emerge at any moment. On a couple of occasions, when crossing paths with his Aunt Monica during her periodic visits, the good woman almost fainted from fright upon seeing her nephew's sickly and dark-circled appearance. However, all her concerned questions were only answered with long silences and absent gazes from the boy, as if his mind were in another dimension. Monica called Teresa and Ernesto several times, warning them of their son's strange behavior. Those conversations caused the parents' happy stay on the farm to be marred by growing concern. "Do you think something might have happened to Pedro while we weren't there?" Teresa asked her husband with manifest worry. "Monica says he's unrecognizable, he looks like a zombie." Ernesto pondered his wife's words for a few moments before responding. "I don't know, honey. Maybe we made a mistake in leaving him alone after all. He's always been a boy prone to fantasies and focusing too much on any idea that gets into his head. But being like this, absent and terrified, according to what your sister says." Teresa shuddered, shaking her head. "I'm afraid something serious must have happened to leave him in that state." Oh, my boy. Determined to find out what had disturbed their son so much, the Rodriguezes ended their farm vacation earlier than planned. With hearts constricted by a mixture of anguish and remorse, they set out for home as soon as possible. During the tense return journey, neither of them opened their mouths except to exchange brief phrases of driving and worry. The worst omens swirled in both parents' minds, making them relive the terrifying stories about kidnappings, violent acts, and dangerous criminals that abounded in the news. When they finally arrived at their home, the sight that greeted Teresa and Ernesto froze their blood. Pedro, with reddened eyes sunken in violet dark circles, was curled up next to the front door. As he glimpsed his parents' figures through the glass of the entrance, he clung to Ernesto's feet as soon as he opened the door in a fit of desperate need for help. "Dad! Mom!" were the only words he managed to stammer between nervous hiccups before collapsing inert in his stunned father's arms. The following days were a whirlwind. No matter how hard they tried with fruitless words of affection and understanding, Teresa and Ernesto were unable to get a single coherent word out of their son about what had happened in their absence. Pedro remained locked in absolute muteness, with his gaze fixed on nothingness and his lips sealed like a tomb. To further complicate matters, one day the family received an unexpected visit from the police. Two officers showed up claiming to have received an anonymous complaint about suspicious activity and strange movements in Mr. Robinson's house. Upon hearing that name, Pedro involuntarily convulsed and shrank even further into the diminished shadow in which he had installed himself, avoiding any eye contact with the uniformed men. "Does any of you know anything about this?" one of the officers interrogated them, a burly man with an inquisitive look. "We understand that your son and that neighbor have had some, let's say, disagreements. So to speak." Teresa responded with indecisive stammers, not knowing quite what to answer about it. Ernesto, however, laid his gaze on Pedro and observed him silently for a few moments, noticing the imperceptible signs of alteration that shook him. Almost as if he knew or had seen or heard something about Mr. Robinson that terrified him to the bone. It was then that the head of the family understood that he should act quickly. For a few more minutes, silence was the only response the officer received. Luis was beginning to consider using more aggressive tactics when suddenly Pedro slightly raised his head and looked him in the eye with an indescribable expression. "You're not going to believe it," he murmured in a hoarse voice, barely a thread of sound. Luis frowned and leaned forward over the table. "Try me, son. Tell me, and we'll see what to do." Pedro swallowed and his eyes oscillated towards the walls as if he feared that they themselves could listen to him and judge him. Finally, he laid his gaze back on Luis and nodded briefly. "All right. I'll tell you everything I know about Robinson." And so, with a trembling voice, he proceeded to relate each and every one of the disturbing behaviors he had observed in his mysterious neighbor, the hole he had dug in the yard, the heavy bags he had buried there so stealthily, the unsettling furtive movements in the early hours of the morning. As his narration unfolded, Luis's countenance passed from initial curiosity to deep bewilderment, finally settling on a mixture of skepticism and frank horror. When Pedro had finished recounting in great detail the grotesque scene he had glimpsed from the upper floor window of the house, with the strange artificial figures and the workroom plagued with sharp implements, the officer leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples slowly, not quite believing what he had just heard. "Son, all that you've told me is extremely disturbing, of course, but in the hypothetical case that it were true, do you realize how unusual and implausible it sounds? Artificial figures, living mannequins, it sounds like a plot from a horror series or movie. Pedro slowly shook his head, emitting a faint anguished moan. I swear I'm not making it up. Those things were there. I saw them move, contort in a way that... A violent shiver shook him from head to toe. They were real. You have to believe me. Luis made a placating gesture with his hands, trying to calm the boy who was starting to get agitated again. All right. I believe you, he lied to calm him down. But I need more than your word, you understand. If we want to proceed with this investigation and clarify what the hell is going on with that Robinson, we're going to need solid evidence to back up your... Suddenly, the officer fell into a sudden silence, his gaze fixed on Pedro's left wrist, which was shaking before his eyes as the young man rubbed it against the leg of his pants. He blinked for a moment and leaned over the table to see it better. There, darkened among the fine hairs of his arm but still visible, some brownish spots and other minor residues could be distinguished, as if the boy had slightly scratched himself with some kind of powder. What's that on your wrist, son? He inquired, pointing at them. Those stains. Pedro's eyes dilated with a mixture of renewed alarm and horror. He hurried to hide his hand from the officer's view, shrinking in on himself and beginning to tremble uncontrollably. Luis didn't say anything else, but in his head, an idea began to take shape, a plan of action still very diffuse but that perhaps, just perhaps, would manage to shed some light on that intricate and gruesome mystery. A few hours later, a small brigade formed by several heavily armed officers converged on Mr. Robinson's house. Luis led them in person, with a tense countenance and a determined grimace curving his lips. Deploying around the perimeter of the house, the agents covered all possible exits and escape routes. Once the pertinent precautions were taken, Luis faced a small pedestal placed there and addressed the house with a megaphone. Mr. Robinson. This is Officer Luis from the local police. I order you to come out of the house immediately with your hands up. I repeat, come out peacefully, and no harm will come to you. But if you resist, we will be forced to enter by force. Luis's words were followed by a sudden silence. No movement or response came from inside the house, whose windows remained dark and motionless. The officer frowned, unfolding a robust police flashlight from his belt. With a gesture, he indicated to his men to take positions, ready to burst in and subdue the suspect if necessary. Last chance, Mr. Robinson. Come out right now, or I'll come in to get you the hard way, he vociferated again through the megaphone. A few more moments of tense muteness passed, and then, in the silence of the night, a faint sound caught the attention of Luis and his men. A barely perceptible creak, a sort of dragging rustle coming from inside the house. There's movement, one of the agents whispered, tensing his weapon. It seems to be heading towards the front door. All the officers converged their gazes towards the threshold of the entrance, where indeed a dark silhouette was beginning to be glimpsed. Slowly, with a metallic, barely perceptible hiss, the door began to open outwards. Luis squinted and illuminated the opening with his flashlight, pointing the light directly at the dark and indescribable form that was beginning to emerge towards the exterior. What he saw then froze the blood in the veins of all those present. A kind of being slithered out of the house with graceful but artificial movements that defied all natural logic. Its elongated and insubstantial body seemed molded with a thin sheet of plastic tinted light gray, forming a vaguely humanoid silhouette, although exaggeratedly stylized and smooth, without defined features. All the gazes, astonished by horror and incredulity, were captivated by that grotesque form as it sinuously moved forward, mute and impassive. Its footprints imprinted wavy marks on the grass, as if the step of such a light being nevertheless bore an enormous weight. Suddenly, a second figure emerged, crawling behind the first, and then a third, and immediately another. Soon, a small entourage of those shapeless things opened their way, surrounding the exit of the house like an escort of profiled guards. Cold sweat pearled Luis's forehead as he struggled to process whether what he was seeing was real or just a nightmare vision. Luis tightened his grip on the butt of his regulation weapon, making his way among his men to advance with a determined step towards that terrifying cortege emerged from the abyss. He raised his flashlight, illuminating with a steely glow of harsh light the face of the first creature, a shining oval of smooth, immaculate white plastic, completely devoid of features or profiles. "Stop right there!" Luis shouted, wielding his gun. What the hell are you? Identify yourselves immediately, or we'll open fire." In response, the flat white head of the thing turned with a crude snap, as if it had just noticed the presence of the small group of men. Its companions duplicated the gesture, turning their expressionless faces towards the officers in a slow sway of scaly necks. Then a voice reached them suddenly, grave and ethereal, devoid of the slightest modulation, as if it emerged from beyond the grave. "Robinson no longer exists," the first creature murmured with robotic sibilance. "We are perfection made form, flesh molded at will, life sculpted with our own hands." Luis paled until he acquired the lividity of a corpse. His knees faltered for an instant while his bulging eyes blinked again and again, unable to process what they were contemplating. "Fire," was all he managed to articulate in a thread of voice before the first agent opened fire at will on those aberrations. The roar of the accurate shots thundered in the quiet night like a furious thunder, but none of the bullets seemed to have the slightest effect on the inorganic beings. The thin plastic bodies did nothing but sway slightly with each impact, as if they were made of a robust steel alloy and not simple artificial coatings. The shooting ceased after a few tense seconds, with the officers watching in terror the total ineffectiveness of their weapons. From the only visible scratch on the bodies of those things, a fine, barely perceptible crack, a blackish and viscous liquid began to ooze, which produced a grimace of repulsion in all of them. "You see now that our works are perfect," the lead being continued with the same robotic and impassive voice. And immediately afterwards, it extended its forearm towards the astonished men in a sudden and fulminant backhand. An inexplicable invisible shock force hit them head-on, throwing them through the air like rag dolls until they crashed against the facades of the nearest houses. None of them got up again after such a superhuman impact. Only Officer Luis, severely injured and with several broken ribs, managed to raise his head to witness how those repulsive artificial creations began to advance towards the core of the city with their graceful and slow movements, leaving a trail of dark putrid liquid behind their steps. Shortly after, the first calls for help and emergency began to flood the central police station lines. An ominous tide of horror loomed over the city, and nothing and no one seemed capable of stopping it.